Support for this episode comes from the University of San Francisco's SWIG program in Jewish Studies and Social Justice, better known as JSSJ. The JSSJ Graduate Level Certificate Program in JEDI, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, gives professionals the opportunity to bring in valuable skills, tools, and resources organizations need to bridge the generational gap and ensure inclusive growth. JEDI plus JSSJ is more than an educational program. It's a call to action to improve the future of every Jewish institution. Join the growing list of organizations committed to JEDI education and values as a profound pathway to a more just and inclusive world. Apply by August 1st and get in on fall classes beginning soon. Just head to usfca.edu/JEDI.
This is Judaism Unbound, episode 389, Jewish Sunday Schools, Then and Now. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today we've got a really exciting episode that may not sound so exciting from the title, but I promise you, our conversation about the history of Jewish Sunday schools in America actually has a lot to do with Jewish life in America today and how to get to the Jewish life in America we want to see in the future. So we're really excited to have as our guest today Laura Yares, who is the author of a new book which is going to be published in just a few days that is called Jewish Sunday Schools, Teaching Religion in 19th Century America. But before we do that, we have an exciting announcement of our own that we wanted to share, which is that Judaism Unbound has just announced the hiring of a new executive director for the organization. I recently became president of a foundation called Lippman Camphor Foundation for Living Torah. And while I'm continuing to host the Judaism Unbound podcast, as well as doing other things for Judaism Unbound, like serving on the board, teaching in the yeshiva, I am no longer the executive director of Judaism Unbound. I'm no longer the person running the organization. I am so excited about the new executive director for Judaism Unbound, Miriam Turlinchamp. You may remember her back from episode 113 called Embrace the Weird, about how she turned around a synagogue in Cincinnati. And then we had her on again just a few months ago on episode 374, Judaism Inbound, and we talked about a class that Miriam and I have been co-teaching in the yeshiva, oriented towards people that are considering converting to Judaism, that are in the process of converting to Judaism. And I have to tell you that it's been an incredible experience to be co-teaching this class with Miriam, and it's really been an amazing experience to meet all the students in the class. But we're not talking about the class right now. We're talking about the incredible Miriam Turlinchamp, who is really just a fantastic leader for this organization. She is someone who shares our values, shares our ideas, has been the genesis of many of our ideas and much of our thinking, has been a thought partner for so many years, a really close friend, and someone who I could not have wished for somebody more exciting to hand over the keys to this car. We are also growing our team with the addition of a number of other folks, Todd Brecker, Hannah Gelman, and Micah Sandman. They are helping us keep the organization going, get the podcast all scheduled and recorded properly, edited. They are helping us get the yeshiva operating more smoothly, lining up teachers. They're doing all these things that, frankly, for a number of years, Lex and Katie and I have been doing usually pretty well, often a little bit not as well as we wanted, to the point of exhaustion. And we're really so happy that we're able to grow this organization and bring on such incredibly talented people. We are so excited about this next chapter. So Miriam Turlinchamp officially begins in October after the high holidays. And Todd, Micah, and Hannah are already on board, and they're already doing a lot of work. So if you've been thinking that, hey, that Judaism Unbound sounding a little bit better lately, that's thanks to those folks. So if you want to get to know our new staff a little bit more, just check it out at judaismunbound.com/team, or you can also go to judaismunbound.com/growing to get a fuller sense of the ways that our organization is expanding in our work. And so now let's go back to our conversation with Laura Yares. Again, Laura Yares is the author of the new book, Jewish Sunday Schools, Teaching Religion in 19th Century America, which will be published by NYU Press on August 1st, 2023. And by the way, you can purchase that book for 30% off with the discount code Yares, that is Yares 30, FM. And you can do that at the NYU Press website, which you can also find through the link in the show notes to this episode. Laura Yares is Assistant Professor of Religious Studies at Michigan State University, and she has a joint appointment in the MSU program for Jewish Studies. Her research and teaching focuses on Jews and Judaism in modernity, with particular interest in Jewish education, hence her book about Jewish Sunday schools. Laura Yares has a PhD in religious studies from Georgetown University, a bachelor's degree and a master's degree from Oxford University. We are thrilled to welcome her for what I'm sure, because we already recorded it, is going to be a fantastic conversation. So, Laura Yares, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to be here with the both of you.
Well, reading your book made me think of my childhood growing up in Long Island in the 1970s. And I was reflecting on it, and I don't think that when we talked about that Jewish school thing that you did after school or other than school, I think we synonymously used words like Sunday school, Hebrew school, religious school. And I don't think we made a distinction. I was trying to think in my head, is it possible that you could ask a person, when do you go to Sunday school? And they would have said Wednesdays. I'm not sure about that, but it was to the level that it might have been. So when you're talking about Sunday schools, can you describe the world in which Sunday schools existed in the 19th century and what maybe there was before and what maybe there was after? How do we understand the term Sunday schools in your work?
So we've got to go back to 1838. That's when the first Sunday school is started by Rebecca Gratz in Philadelphia, who's a really pioneering American Jewish woman philanthropist. And she's working with other women who are women of some means. And they notice that Jewish children in Philadelphia are mostly children of recent immigrants. This is a time when we're seeing a lot of Jewish immigrants arriving in the US from Central Europe. And they don't have the financial or other resources to attend Jewish day institutions, right? So when we think of what Jewish education looked like prior to the founding of the first Sunday school, we're looking at what we might refer to today as day schools, but they're not quite the same. So there are some private academies run by teachers, and there are congregational schools that are run by synagogues. And those schools are providing both basic reading, writing, arithmetic, as well as Jewish studies, Jewish instruction. This is the late 1830s, so we're starting to see more public schools also arriving on the scene, which are free of cost, but they're not exactly neutral. Right? These are very much Protestant institutions. They're Protestant proselytizing institutions, but they're very attractive to recently arrived immigrant Jewish parents because they're affordable. They're conducted in English. So children are going to have the ability to learn English proficiently, which is something that their parents can't necessarily teach them at this point. And it sort of seems to signal that American Jews are sort of in on this American project, right? That they're sending their kids to these public schools. And so if you fall in this gap of not having the resources to send your child to a full-time Jewish institution, there's really not a lot of other options, right? We've got to cast our minds back to a time when the American Jewish community is very, very, very small and doesn't have anything like the institutional landscape that we have today. So Rebecca Gratz notices that not only do these children not have a Jewish educational option, but they're actually quite vulnerable to Protestant missionaries. They're vulnerable in the public schools, and they're vulnerable on Sunday mornings when Protestants are going out and they're recruiting children who are playing on the street to come into their religious institutions. They don't have enough basic Jewish vocabulary to give a rationale for why they are not Christian, right? For why Christian proselytizing is not something that they want to engage in. Now, to give just a really, really potted history of Protestant Sunday schools, before the establishment of public schools, Protestant Sunday schools too used to teach not only religious instruction, but also the sort of full curricular gamut of reading, writing, arithmetic, and religious subjects. And when public schools began to become more numerous, they sort of scaled their operations back to focus on a purely religious curriculum. This is happening at the same time that Rebecca Gratz is seeing the need for Jewish immigrant children. And so she takes this model that has begun to work quite well for Protestants and says, you know what, this will work well for Jewish children as well. This will give them somewhere to go on Sunday mornings so that they are not likely to be swept in to these Protestant schools. And she writes that Protestant teachers used to go into the streets and offer sort of prizes and trinkets if you would come in. And so it's about giving Jewish students a place to go, and it's about giving them a sort of basic literacy so that when they are inevitably proselytized, they have enough basic understanding of their own tradition that they can give some kind of account of why they are Jewish rather than interested in converting to Christianity. And so the model that she devises uses the resources at her disposal to make sure that this institution is accessible, that it can be accessed by people who did not have financial means. And so she gathered the women around her who like Rebecca Gratz herself, were affluent women who had time to volunteer to charity projects, and they volunteered their time. They went on Sunday mornings and they volunteered as teachers. Many of them were actually teachers in Jewish private academies or other kinds of private academies during the week. So they had some teaching skills already. So this was very much taking into their volunteer work on behalf of Jews skills that they already were using in other parts of their life. So when we think about the range of nomenclature that we have for describing these kinds of Jewish institutions, when we talk about Sunday school, we're talking about school that literally just happened on a Sunday. When that model began to spread across the country, different institutions, different communities tinkered with the format. Some of them had multiple sessions during the week, and those schools tended to be called religious schools. Later, a more common nomenclature that comes into play is Hebrew school, which you mentioned. That's really a product of the 20th century. That's the product of a moment when the curriculum for Jewish supplementary education changes in an effort to incorporate aspects of Jewish curriculum that had not been included within the Sunday school model because there was limited time and resources.
In all my thinking about why we have institutions in a certain way, why is Jewish school on Sunday, I figured it was because it was the weekend and then there were Shabbat services on Saturday. But the idea that it was to prevent the Jews from being on the street on Sundays where the Protestants were going around trying to proselytize, that I've never heard before. That's fascinating. That's so interesting. I'm wondering how the parents of the kids at this time thought about the Sunday schools that they were about to send their kids to. What was their Jewish education back in Europe? And were they looking at these Sunday schools as, it's like a pale shadow of what we had back in Europe, but it's all there is here and it's okay? Or were these people who actually didn't have that much Jewish education in Europe either, and what they were experiencing in America was actually sort of more than they might have had?
One of the challenges of writing this book was that there were relatively few first-person narratives from students, from teachers, from parents that can give us a really deep flavor of what it was like to be institution. So we have to infer a little bit based on what we know about this demographic. Unlike the later wave of migrants who start arriving in 1881, who are coming primarily from Eastern Europe, who are coming because of pull factors that are attracting them to the US, but also because of push factors that are making life untenable in the various parts of Eastern Europe and Russia where they formerly lived. For many of these Central European migrants, they were coming because they were attracted to the opportunities, right, that America had. For the most part, this was a generation who were very mobile, looking to establish themselves in America. And it's fair to say that Jewish education might not have been their first priority. We do know from a lot of records that I found in some of the congregational archives that just like American Jewish parents today, Jewish parents in the 19th century were sort of torn between how many activities their children could fit in to their free time and what would be most sort of advantageous to them as people. So we hear a lot from rabbis saying, okay, parents, we know that you're enrolling your children in dance classes and music classes and French and German classes, but you're really not giving a lot of effort and attention to the Sunday school. There was another record that I included in the book from a child who recalled that, when she went to Sunday school, she found Chumash, that is reading the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, to be quite challenging. And so she asked her father to use his influence as the head of the congregational board to get it taken out of the curriculum. And he did. Just like parents today, right? These parents were trying to balance all of the different interests and opportunities that are open to their children. And once Judaism became another option, right, for how one spends one's leisure time, as opposed to a sort of all-encompassing source of one's cultural and social identity, Jewish education has to compete with a whole lot of other stuff that children and their parents are interested in.
So this is very fun so far. I would like to talk about a few particular terms that are big in your book. I want to talk about catechism. I want to talk about confirmation. And I'm using those two both because they play a big role in your book and because I think they will feel to listeners, in the case of catechism, like a very, very Christian inflected term. And in the case of confirmation, I'll give one very, not two varies, but a very Christian inflected term. Like, I think it's a little more of a middle ground because confirmation is still to this day seen as a Jewish ritual. But I think even when it is, it's seen as one deeply inflected through Christianity historically. And there's an awareness that we sort of got this idea of a coming of age ritual sometime in high school from Christianity. So catechism's confirmation. Your book is sneaky. And I say that only as a compliment. Your book, to somebody looking at it on the shelf, probably appears to be about Sunday school. And it is. But I think more than that, it's about what the heck is religion, or is Judaism a religion, through the framework of Sunday schools in the 19th and early 20th century. Big questions about what Judaism even is. Are we sort of a national identity group or a people? Are we a religion? And Sunday schools provide a window into that. And so these two words, catechisms and confirmations, I think they help with that. So catechism, I want to hear your definition. I'm not going to say too much about it, but suffice to say, it is a mechanism that many, many, many rabbis seem to use to distill Judaism to a specific bullet-pointed set of beliefs. And confirmation is a ritual at the end of one's Sunday school flow to also mark, usually publicly through uttering principles in front of an audience, a sort of active confirmation, an active adoption of beliefs. And what they're doing is they're establishing Judaism as something alongside Christianity and other religions. So can you talk to us about why that is so important to do in this time period? Why are we so interested, we being like the Jewish collective? And it does seem to be kind of across the board. So can you talk to us about why there were so many different avenues to cement Judaism as a religion and how Sunday schools and Jewish education sort of played a role in that?
Absolutely. So you ask about catechisms. In the book, I define catechisms as a technology. And I think when we think about catechisms as a technology, it can really help us understand how this kind of text could cross denominational lines with such ease. Jews wrote catechisms in droves in the 18th century and in the 19th century. And they didn't just write them in America, they wrote them in Europe and other parts of the Jewish world as well. In fact, the first Jewish catechisms in America were imported from Europe.
Unless people say that you're calling them a catechism, like I just want to note that the book literally said the word catechism on the cover.
Yeah, they were called catechisms. That's the word that they use, right? And so again, let's think about catechisms as a technology, right? Let's try, if we can, and strip our minds away from thinking of catechisms as this distinctively Catholic genre, right? Which is how I think most people think about them today. Think about the catechism of the Catholic Church. You know, when I started my research, particularly when I was a graduate student, I used to hear a lot from people when I talked about Jewish catechisms. Oh, honey, Jews didn't write catechisms. You must be mistaken. poor little English girl over here studying American Jewish education. You don't really know what you're talking about. That's incorrect. So what's a catechism? A catechism is a primer, right? It's a question and answer short text that was designed to condense or distill lots and lots of information in a short and accessible format, right? Question, answer, question, answer, question, answer. And they were designed for children to be able to memorize and recite them. If you have an educational situation where you have to teach large numbers of children in a short amount of time, particularly if you are having to teach children who are not all at the same age or developmental stage, right? We're going back to a time when the idea of being separated by grade levels isn't something that is happening in Jewish education, Christian education, or actually general education either. That's a development that comes later in the 19th and into the 20th century. So think about the situation, right? The pedagogical problem that you have to solve. You have mixed age levels, lots of children in a classroom. You have them for a short amount of time, and you want to make sure that you get lots of information across. You want them to have this basic framework for understanding what Judaism is, what the Jewish calendar is, what basic Jewish principles are, Jewish values, what the Hebrew Bible is all about. Well, a catechism is a helpful technology for doing that, because if a child memorizes these questions and answers, then you sort of get this semblance that they know it, that they've obtained this knowledge. So the fact that Jews wrote catechisms and taught catechisms, and that children memorized catechisms and recited them at their confirmation ceremonies to confirm their commitments to Judaism, is really no different than some of the discourse we hear in Jewish education today about bringing Jewish education into the digital age and creating apps and using virtual technologies, right, to make Jewish education feel relevant, to make it feel contemporary, and to utilize the best available educational resources that we have. Catechisms today feel archaic and they feel overtly Christian, but they were the educational technology of the time. Now, one of the things that I found so interesting about catechisms when I started this project, the first question that was typically included in a catechism, particularly catechisms that came out of Germany, and that was a style that was employed by most authors of catechisms in America too. They began with the question, what is religion? And to me, as a person who had done all of my graduate work in departments of religious studies, if you have spent time in academic departments of religious studies as an undergraduate, you've typically taken a course that's called something like Theories and Methods in Religious Studies, or Theories and Methods in World Religions. And what you learn in that course is that the word religion doesn't have a strong sort of conceptual definition, right? It's a word that has changed over time, and different kind of meanings have been sort of inflected into it. And in most histories of American Jewish education, if they've said anything about 19th century Sunday schools, and most of them don't, quite frankly, this is a sort of lacuna, right, in the history of American Jewish education, they would say something like, well, they just taught Judaism as a religion. And that was thin. You know, it was just the sort of basic tenets of morality and monotheism. And nothing good in Jewish education happens until the 20th century, with the initiatives of a group who are known as the Benderly Boys. But one of the things we know is that when we say the word religion, that's not a stable category. That changes over the 19th century. So how are Jews making sense of all of these theories that are percolating in 19th century American popular culture about what religion is, right? About what it means to be religious, about the purpose of religion in the context of modernity. And what I found, and catechisms are such a great source for this, is that Sunday schools are a place where Jews are having to do the grassroots work of figuring it out. When the rubber meets the road, you can have sort of grand theories about all sorts of things, about God, about holidays, the calendar, about philosophy. But there's a sort of critical moment in which a young child asks you to define them, and you have to come up with something to say, right? I have a 6 and a 3-year-old, and they regularly ask me questions that force me to sort of bracket to some degree the sort of complexity with which I typically think about these things, and give them an answer that makes sense for them. 19th century Sunday schools are where the rubber meets the road for 19th century Jews. They're producing a lot of philosophical work about religion and what it means, and they're engaging with all these theories of comparative religious studies. They're writing documents like the Pittsburgh Platform, which is one of the central statements of belief for the emerging Jewish reform movement in America. And these are all kind of highfalutin, grand ideas about what it means for Judaism to be a religion in modernity. But what are you going to teach your kids? What do you do with them on a Sunday morning? How do you make Judaism make sense for them in these terms? And that's the project of the Sunday schools. They're trying to figure out what it means for Judaism to be a religion. And what I discovered in researching the book is that they're sort of running on a treadmill of trying to keep up with all these sort of changing ideas, changing theories, because they've got to make Judaism feel relevant.
So this piece you mentioned about how folks writing histories of this time period, if they talk about Sunday school at all, they tend to say, oh, so thin, very little happening or little good happening. And that's not all they tend to say. And this is not my idea. This is mentioned prominently in your book. They conflate the fact of the thinness and the not very goodness with a bunch of women doing this. It's a super gender, both at the time. So you detail. And so part of my question is like, talk to us even about what folks were saying as these new Sunday schools were emerging. I mean, it's funny to break the fourth wall for a second. Like, we're a Jewish podcast that is really interested in spotlighting new upstart Jewish things that often face the critique of being thin or being not so authentic, quote unquote. And so I was reading this book and I was like, if we were a podcast in like 1845, I think we probably would have tried to get like, let's get Rebecca Gratz. Like, she seems like she's got this new and a lot of people are criticizing it, but that's who we want on the show. But we have this very familiar dynamic in play where something new is emerging. It's coming from a group of people, largely women. So I think some would say like, the first Sunday school, it was founded by Rebecca Gratz. She happened to be a woman. I kind of read your book as saying it of necessity, if Sunday schools were going to come to be, it was going to be from women. And the way that they manifested and the kinds of material they centered and it's not that men weren't involved, but part and parcel with all of the critiques of it, people really love to say that women they're not trained enough. There's rabbis floating around now. There haven't been rabbis in the U.S. for very long at this point, but there's now rabbis and they should be shaping things and they're teaching the wrong stuff and they're not doing a very good job. So can you talk to us about the ways in which Sunday schools, I mentioned before, this is like a sneaky book that's about things that is not this book is deeply about gender. So how does the evolution of Sunday schools in the mid and late 19th century tie into questions of gender? I mean, it's interesting. We were talking about confirmation before, and that's another space where, that's a ritual that emerges partially, as I understand it, from a place of saying we need actually to have a ritual that transcends, they wouldn't have said the gender binary at the time, but that is not just boys. And that's not the only reason it emerges, but there's all sorts of factors in play where all of a sudden women and girls are, I'm going to say, taking up space. I don't mean in a bad way, but that's how I think some were talking about it. They were taking up space that in previous iterations of Judaism they weren't. And that's part of what might have felt disruptive or not authentic or not so good. So can you talk to us a little bit about that piece?
Absolutely. I think often historians kind of balk at having to make their time period translatable to the present day because it feels like there is a contraction in doing that. But I think in this case, the analogy actually works quite well. In the 19th century, you had women across the country following Rebecca Gratz. Literally within a few months, another women's charity group in New York start to create a Jewish Sunday school. And it was very quick that women who in other cities and in other communities started to follow Rebecca Gratz's model. And it was only a few years later that you had institutions popping up all over the country and in North America. This was a realistic model for Jewish education. It didn't take too much time. It was relatively affordable, and it was seen as a worthwhile and appropriate project for women, right? This was 1840s, the mid 19th century, this was the sort of age of women's voluntarism, right? There were lots of women's charity organizations, of clubs and different organizations like that, through which women, typically women of means, right? Women who had leisure time to spare because they weren't forced to contribute to the family economy, could do all sorts of charitable projects. And that's really what Jewish Sunday schools are. They're a charitable project by women for the Jewish community that very much were thought to fall within women's domain because women were understood as child rearers, right? As people whose responsibilities included raising children. And although it is a realistic model for Jewish education in America, it is, as you say, Lex, disruptive because it puts male educators out of a job. Typically, if a rabbi was hired at a congregation, responsibility for that congregational all-day school would be a big part of his portfolio. Sunday schools are making it less tenable for rabbis to have kind of full-time employment, right, in congregations. We see a lot in this period of men who are advertising their wares as Jewish educators, as tutors, as heads of academies, and they're posting notices in the Jewish press of the time saying things like, I'm available to teach children Jewish subjects, and here are all of my references. They're coming with deep knowledge. And this isn't where parents are choosing to invest their time for their children. And so part of the pushback against Jewish Sunday schools is coming from men who are seeing themselves being written out of a job as Jewish educators. And to them, it seems quite incredulous that despite all of their training and all of their knowledge and all of these expertise, parents would choose an institution run by women who didn't have any of that kind of educational exposure. So we have to remember that these were women who came of age during the early part of the 19th century, and they would have had a very, very sparse Jewish educational training of their own. So when they're being criticized by men for not knowing anything, for not having any Jewish knowledge to bring to the task, that's not an inaccurate criticism. But to sort of heap derision on these women for having such a thin educational curriculum without following that up with, and that's because they weren't given an education themselves, right? But nevertheless, they were trying to give over what they had, and they were using the expertise that they had at their disposal to nevertheless give children an accessible means to access Jewish education. Feels a little bit unfair, right? And so I think it is not that the criticism of 19th century schools as being thin is completely inaccurate. It's that it doesn't tell the whole story. Many of the women who taught in these Sunday schools might not have had Jewish expertise, but they did have pedagogical expertise. Because this is the period in American history when you're starting to see normal schools, which are teacher training colleges, established to train teachers to teach in the new public schools that are being founded. And a lot of women, and especially a lot of Jewish women, are training as teachers. And so many, many, many of the women who are teaching in Sunday schools are trained educators.
And the rabbis aren't, by the way.
No.
Rabbis aren't getting anything like that.
No, not at all. This is very much just a women's domain of expertise, and it's thought of women's expertise, right? Pedagogy is thought of as something that is very much women's work. And so in a lot of the congregational records, we see statements of women teachers saying things like, wow, it's so miraculous that they can keep these unruly classrooms under control. And that's because these women knew how to run a classroom. And if you've ever spent time even today in an elementary school, you'll know that is no mean feat and involves a serious amount of skill and training. And so to dismiss these women because of the lack of Jewish knowledge that they have received and not counter that they did have other forms of knowledge, not only doesn't do justice to these women, but also speaks to the lack of value on pedagogical skill that may exist in Jewish education, even until today, a privileging of Jewish knowledge and not necessarily pedagogical training.
My nephew recently got in touch with me, and I think prompted by my sister, to ask me if I had any recommendations for him about classroom management because he might be teaching like fifth graders. And I was like, I know nothing about classroom management. I teach online to adults who want to be there. And so really, I'm not the right person to consult. I feel like what you're just describing here, if we look at what you're talking about as a case study about disruptive innovation and some of the things that we're looking at today, it becomes all the more relevant and all the more interesting. It's like Lex and me. We don't have a PhD in anything, but we do our best to kind of do a version of trying to get this knowledge out into the world. And I think it would be totally reasonable for people to say, well, what you're doing is thin. You don't know all the details and all the depth of what you're talking about. And all of that's right. And yet at the same time, it's like, yeah, but the thick version isn't able to spread in the way that is needed. And in our case, it has to do with the case that I just gave you. It has to do with the effort to get at breadth. But there's also an economic issue going on today. So I'm thinking about how in the story that you're talking about, it's that the people don't have the money to be able to afford to spend more money on on Jewish education. And so as a result, there's a need to have a cheaper version of Jewish education that can be available. And these people who say, I'm being put out of a job are aggrieved. But the reality is that those people couldn't have afforded what they were offering. And so how do you manage the reality that the way we have things set up in our society at a certain point in time is not compatible with the needs of the people who are actually seeking the thing that we're talking about? And this is just a fascinating example. So I'm wondering just for your thoughts about that more broadly, but then I'm also wondering if you could tell us a little bit about who Rebecca Gratz was at the time that she founded this Hebrew school. Like, what was her background? And I'm also just curious about, you talked a little bit about the Benderly boys. I'm curious about what might have been a counterfactual if the Benderly boys hadn't come around. Like, how might we have imagined this Hebrew school changing over time and evolving into something that maybe we would look at and say, oh, we wish we had that?
So in this era, it wasn't only that parents couldn't afford to send their children to more intensive educational, Jewish educational programs. It's also that they didn't necessarily exist in the places where Jews were beginning to live. So this is an era in which Jews spread across the country. They're in places that have more institutional resources and less Jewish institutional resources. They are acclimating to the US in various ways. Many Jews in this era are married to people who are not Jewish. So the question of accessibility is a really, really important one. Today, we are also living in an era where accessibility is a really, really important criteria to consider. Not all Jews live in New York, Chicago, San Francisco, Detroit, right? I'm sitting here recording this conversation in East Lansing, Michigan, and we don't have a lot of Jewish communal resources here, as many places in the country don't have. And so there is a necessity to be nimble. The question that tracks across the 19th century into today is this question of what does it mean for Jewish education to be accessible? And that means not only financial accessibility, but also geographical accessibility. Let's not forget that the people who are parents of young Jewish children today are millennials, and millennials have been crushed by the financial events of the past decade. And there is well-documented evidence that millennial parents are facing financial challenges that previous generations never had to encounter. As the American Jewish community diversifies and Jewish parents come from demographics that really sort of push us beyond what we might have thought of as the sort of demographic mainstay of American Judaism, non-white, non-middle class. I think this question of what it means to be financially accessible is a really, really important one. So the question of Rebecca Gratz. What do we know about Rebecca Gratz? Rebecca Gratz was wealthy. She came from a wealthy Sephardic family in Philadelphia. They had made their fortune from shipping and trading. And there is a wonderful, wonderful biography of Rebecca Gratz written by the late, great historian Diane Ashton that I very much recommend. Rebecca Gratz was unmarried. She did not have a family of her own, although she was a sort of loco parentis role to many of her nieces and nephews. And so Rebecca Gratz came of age in this moment in the first half of the 19th century where women were becoming involved in organized charity work.
And did she have a substantial Jewish education?
No, not at all.
Well,
It is not well known exactly what she knew, but Ashton speculates that she was probably pretty typical of her era, of her generation. What she would have been taught really would have depended on how much time and energy her parents had to teach Hebrew or other matters. They probably employed a tutor to come and give their daughters lessons at home. The things that she probably knew were in the category that historians sometimes call domestic Judaism, right? How to keep a kosher kitchen, how to celebrate the holidays, blessings. She liked to read the Bible, but she would have read it in English rather than Hebrew. She did not have a strong command of Hebrew. But let's remember she was involved in a congregation, a traditional congregation, where women didn't have any particular public-facing roles to play. To a certain extent, an education that was about sort of extensive knowledge of the liturgy, of Hebrew, right, was not a thing that most parents decided to invest in female children. So Rebecca Gratz did not have an extensive Jewish education. And in that first Sunday school, she was really teaching what she knew. Bible reading in English, Jewish values, holidays, and what we might call the sort of spiritual side of Judaism.
Going back to the very, very beginning of our show, we've had this framework of knowledge and chutzpah, knowledge versus chutzpah curves. We have literal graphs of this if you go back long enough. Not that they're scientific, but we have, as an organization, taken a pretty strong stand that the idea of people needing to have quote unquote Jewish knowledge in order to be at the front of Jewish rooms, whether that's a Sunday school classroom, a room of prayer, a room of song, a room of justice work, whatever, like that's done a lot of harm. And consistently people, honestly, even people who have a lot of Jewish knowledge, they think that they don't. And so they refrain from inhabiting some of those roles. And all the more so people who genuinely have not, internalized certain forms of Jewish traditional knowledge, certain texts that they would know about, certain language facility like with Hebrew. So it's really interesting to hear about that. And I wanna really dwell there because in your book, you talk about some of the debates. And I think this is a little bit towards the later part of your time frame between people who, given the time constraints. So this is all, within a framework where we only have a couple hours a week or a few hours a week. But there's this huge debate that I think, and you can correct me if you see this as too simplistic, it kind of boils down to whether those couple hours should be devoted to learning Jewish things, knowing Jewish things versus feeling Jewish emotions. And I'm using emotions and these are consciously gendered terms historically. And I think that feeling emotions is generally painted as a feminine, quote unquote, thing. Knowing things, rationality, reason is painted as a masculine thing. But I think that question about sort of what's our goal here is our goal, because looking back at catechisms, right? Like, let's say there's a list of, let's even say 10 commandments. That's not a catechism. Like, there's 10 commandments. It is a very different pedagogical act to teach people that there are 10 commandments and here's what they are, and now you know what those are. That's a different pedagogical act than it is to teach people to hold 10 core notions as true and believe them to be ordained by God. So can you give us a window into some of those debates about whether the core act here is about teaching people to know things versus teaching to feel things? And I guess, what are the ramifications of that? I don't think it's just an interesting theoretical question. Why were people writing warring op-eds about this, about how we need to do one versus the other?
So when I was doing the research for the dissertation that became this book, I was also earning a little bit of extra cash by teaching in a Sunday school in a large Reform synagogue in Washington, D.C. I have this distinct memory of the teacher orientation at the start of one of the school years and the rabbi coming in to assess the volunteer teachers who, were mostly undergraduate students, graduate students like myself, retired folks, or folks who, for various reasons, were either looking for a way to earn a little bit of extra money or a way to give back to their community. quasi kind of volunteer, barely paid labor force that is not dissimilar to 19th century education. And the rabbi said, I want you all to know as teachers that if a student doesn't learn anything over this year, but they associate the temple as a place that they feel comfortable and they like to be, then this has been a success. And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting, but you're still asking them to be listening to these tapes of the cantor who has recorded the parsha for the Babat or Bi mitzvahs, and you're still putting them through all of these different lessons and chugs and options that are really all about knowing stuff. And at the same time, of course, I was spending my days in the Library of Congress reading Jewish catechisms that were precisely about cramming students' heads with knowledge. And so I think this is a 19th century question that Jewish educators are still wrestling with today. And it's one of those sort of pendulum swings, right? At different times and different moments in different kinds of institutions, right? The pendulum swings towards sort of affect or towards knowledge. Camp, I think, is so lauded and valued in the Jewish world because the emphasis is so squarely on affect, of children having these sort of enjoyable, transformational times, whereas supplementary education, the pendulum has swung a little bit to more towards content knowledge, and that is not necessarily seen as a fun, exciting, or transformational experience for most of the children who are attending schools. As you say, this question of knowledge and this question of affect are very, very gendered terms. In the 19th century, this idea of learning information, of learning to understand Judaism as a rational religion was seen as very masculine. And most of the catechisms that American Jewish children used in their Sunday schools were written by men. This was, I think, a real indication that we need to think again when we describe the 19th century Sunday school as women's religion, as feminized religion, because so much of the time that children spent in Sunday schools was spent memorizing these catechisms that were written by men in these decidedly masculine frameworks for thinking about how religion is to be learned. And what women had to teach, Bible stories, morality, was for much of the 19th century labeled as female and feminized until the beginning of the 20th century. And that's a moment in which a philosopher called William James starts to argue that religion is about feeling. Feeling is really at the heart of the religious experience. And if you want people to be committed to their religion, committed to their religious institutions, then activating feeling starts to feel like a masculine approach to Jewish education. And so all of a sudden, at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, in the Reform movement in particular, you start to see a lot of rabbis, people who are thinking and writing about Jewish education, saying, you know what, let's forget about cramming their heads with knowledge. We need to make Jewish education places where students learn to feel a connection to religion, because this is what this new science of developmental psychology is telling us is the key to child development. But of course, this is also a time when the Jewish landscape is changing dramatically. You have a huge influx of migrants from Eastern Europe and Russia who are bringing to the landscape a whole range of new kinds of Jewish educational institutions. Prior to 1880, the Reform movement had really dominated the American Jewish landscape and had dominated Jewish Sunday schools at that point as well. Beginning in the latter decades of the 19th century into the 20th, there is a much broader range of Jewish educational options and models that are coming onto the table. And many of those models are models that emphasize that Jewish education is actually about content acquisition. So we're thinking about Talmud Torahs, about Cheders, typically one room. The word cheder in Hebrew means room. So this sort of like one room after school educational institution, typically for young children. Talmud Torahs are community institutions often for older children. And so you really do have this moment at the turn of the 20th century in which there are sort of two camps. There's a camp that is saying, cramming children's head with memorized knowledge isn't working. Let's develop the way that people feel. And you have another camp which is saying, no, children need to acquire knowledge, right? Mostly male children need to acquire knowledge. And what you get is something of a compromise, But if we look ahead to the post-war era, to American Judaism in the sort of 1950s and 60s, the institution that ends up prevailing looks a lot more like the 19th century Sunday school than Benderly's model for Jewish learning. Children come to their Jewish educational institution, which is under the auspices of a synagogue, which is led by a rabbi. They come on Sundays, maybe a day or two during the week as well. And what they're learning is about Judaism as a set of religious commitments. They're learning about religious knowledge. They're learning the skills and the dispositions and the knowledge that they need to graduate a religious coming of age ceremony, right? Bar, bat, bar mitzvah, maybe later confirmation. Whereas Benderly's model was really about Judaism as a more kind of lived communal experience.
So I want to ask a closing question that relates back to the question of confirmation, partially because it's associated with Shavuot, which is one of my favorite holidays, and it's where we first met you. We're going to put a link in the show notes to your wonderful talk about confirmation that you gave in Shavuot Live. But what's so central to it in the 19th century, and to some extent maybe even now, is that it boils down to an act of embracing the faith, saying like, I am Jewish, in a world where there is sort of a question around whether somebody who grows up Jewish will stay Jewish or not. And I feel like that thread of, are we going to keep them Jewish or are we going to successfully win that battle? That's the consistent thread of Jewish education from the 1800s all the way till now. And I don't say that with a ton of happiness. So I guess I'm curious if you can offer up a little bit about how that has actually stayed very consistent and other pieces of your book that are still operating in our Jewish educational sphere today?
This question of Jewish continuity, this question of, is whatever Jewish educational setting a good Jewish educational input for producing the output of a committed, which typically means synagogue member, married or partnered to a Jewish person, right, is raising kids as Jewish. That's such a limited way to think about what education is for and what education does. Scholars of education, more broadly outside of the Jewish context, really encourage us to think about educational environments, about schools as total institutions, as cultural environments. And what we learn when we think of schools in that way is that the grades that a student gets, right, the GPA that they graduate with is only one very, very small piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding the kind of educational experience that somebody has. We think also about the friendships that they cultivate, the extracurricular activities that they get to participate in, the confidence that they get to develop, the way that the school serves as a community institution, offering opportunities for the broader community to participate in continued learning and leisure activities. And there are so many things that a school does that is not measured by grades and GPAs. So too, assessing Jewish educational institutions solely by the metric of whether they produce quote unquote committed Jews, and that question of what it means to be a committed Jew is a very politicized idea, right? What that means for you, Lex, might be very, very different to somebody else, right? It's a very, very limited way to understand what is going on in a Jewish educational space. And what I tried to do in the book is to really draw attention to a much broader set of impacts and happenings and experiences. There's a whole world of material culture that springs up around Jewish Sunday schools, particularly around Shavuot, to make Shavuot this really, really grand end of the year spectacle. And all this is really, really important cultural work that Jewish Sunday schools are doing that is not really sort of centered in the domain of what's happening in terms of a person's Jewish commitments, but lying in the domain of how is Judaism being animated, being sort of lived out within the contemporary currency of American religion. The question of whether a Jewish educational institution produces quote unquote committed Jews also begs the question of, when do you evaluate that? Right. Is that the question that you ask to a 16-year-old when they finish their confirmation? Is it a question that you ask at 21 when somebody's graduated college? Is it a question that you ask when somebody is getting married or raising their children or becoming a grandparent? So we could think of any possible kind of life stages or life markers or life experiences in which that question might yield a very, very different set of answers. Tying Jewish education to questions of Jewish continuity has, I think, done a lot of harm. And it has led historians and other people who write about Jewish education to describe the labor that many, many Jews have participated in as being devoid of value. And this is particularly Jewish women. Still today, Jewish supplementary education doesn't get a lot of good press. Still today, it is predominantly women who are serving as teachers in Jewish supplementary schools, in congregational schools. And so we might be sort of led to believe that nothing good is happening, that no children are having good experiences, that no teachers are forging social connections or having continuing educational experiences of their own. And the reality is that we just don't ask that question a lot of the time. We just look at these questions of Jewish continuity. And even today, people who research the contemporary Jewish world don't typically take Jewish supplementary school education very seriously or ask questions beyond, does it lead to committed Jewish outputs? And the idea that Jewish education should be a feeder institution to legacy institutions is an idea that is live and well. You see it in the requirement that parents need to become members of synagogues if they want their child to have a bar bat or be mitzvah in that institution. The other model, though, that we see in this period that really only lasts in this period is the idea that, you know what, we need to take Jewish education to where the people are. The model of taking Jewish education to where the people are and shaping it according to their specific needs isn't the model that seems to triumph in the post-war era of congregational synagogues becoming the default institution of American Jewish life. But it is a model, I think, that we are seeing American Jews and particularly American Jewish parents flock to in increasing numbers today. As parents are looking around at their options and saying, you know what, I don't necessarily want to join the synagogue. It's not a place that is meaningful to me. It's not a place that I feel like matches my values. It's not a social community that I particularly want to be part of. But I do want my children to have these Jewish educational experiences. I want them to have the opportunity to mark these Jewish milestones of coming of age. And so I'm going to look for other kinds of models. I'm going to look for independent tutoring. I'm going to look for virtual educational options. I'm going to look outside the synagogue for educational opportunities that feel more authentic to who we are as a family. I think is a model that is very, very lively in the 19th century, that non-synagogue model for Jewish education that sort of dies out in the 20th century. But I think we can only assume that it is going to become increasingly popular in the decades to come.
Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a fantastic conversation.
It was so great to be here. Thank you so much for the chat.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. As a reminder, if you listen to this episode and we're like, oh my gosh, this book has to be on my bookshelf, we totally agree. And you should head to our show notes where you can find a link to purchase the book. It's got a discount code associated with it. But just in case, we're going to say the discount code here too, YARES 30-FM. And you can use that at the NYU Press website. That's the only place you'll be able to use that discount code. So be sure to purchase Jewish Sunday Schools, the book, at NYU Press's website. Also, Dan mentioned this at the top, but our team is growing. It's very, very exciting. You can learn more at www.judaismunbound.com/growing, where you'll see some information about Miriam Turlinchamp, our new executive director, and also 3 other new staff members, Todd Brecker, Hannah Gelman, and Micah Sandman. So definitely learn more about our amazing new staff members. You're going to be meeting them at some of our upcoming events. It's very exciting times for Judaism Unbound. The last thing we want to say in this episode and all of our episodes is that we deeply appreciate it when you are in touch with us. It means the world to us, and here are all the different ways that you can do so. First, there's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. All of those are at Judaism Unbound for our handles. Second, there's our website, JudaismUnbound.com, where you can check out the show notes for this episode, learn about the Anya Shiva, our digital center for Jewish learning and unlearning, so much more. And of course, there's our email addresses, dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. We love it when folks send their ideas, visions, dreams, questions, all of those to our inboxes. So thanks so much for listening. And the very last thing we'll say is that support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Ashman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Ashman Family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.